PrivacyCast, India's leading privacy podcast. Today we are here with none other than Arya Tripathi. Arya Tripathi is a partner in technology and data privacy team at Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas. She's a CIPPA and holds most of the privacy certifications. I've known her for such a long time. We've been working in privacy for so long. I think I'm very privileged for her to be here with us. And we're looking forward today to know more about the Indian draft DPDP rules that have just passed, and we're going to talk about the roles and responsibilities of consent managers. And wait till the end because we're going to talk about whether there is a conflict of interest if privacy compliance providers can actually become consent managers for organizations. So let's get going. So Arya, welcome to the show. And why don't we start with what is a consent manager?
Thank you, Akash. Thank you, PrivacyCast team, and all the listeners. Wishing everybody a great 2025. 2025 obviously has started with a bang for the privacy ecosystem. Uh, Consent manager, a very relevant, very debated and discussed topic. Everybody has been evaluating who they are and what they are going to offer to compliance matrix under the DPDP Act. And why is this relevant? Because to take a step back, Akash, and as our listeners would have already known this, consent is the primary basis of processing. Uh, while it is the primary basis of processing, it is one of the most difficult processing bases to fall back upon because it calls for a higher degree of transparency and accountability. And therefore, you would see that India has come up with a unique, innovative concept of an intermediary that is called consent manager. So consent manager has been defined under the Digital Personal Data Protection Act as a single point of contact for a data principal to be able to basically manage their consent flow, starting from giving to withdrawing, or for that matter, even modifying the consent flow. And also all the data principal rights which emanate from consent base of processing, such as right to correction, right to access. So entire consent flow can be managed through a consent manager. Data principal may decide to avail the services of a consent manager, provided that consent manager is an organization that is registered with the Data Protection Board. And of course, the registration requirement, as you would understand, for every regulated entity will be bifurcated into certain financial thresholds, certain technical thresholds, certain operational thresholds. And that is where the rules are intended to
Financial is 2 crores, if I'm correct.
correct. Financial
Yeah.
at this point in time has been fixed at a minimum of 2 CR, which roughly translates to about 250,000 US dollars as per currency exchange rate. And while we're talking on the financial thresholds, I think it is going to be slightly problematic for startups and smaller organizations to be in a position to meet this financial threshold. Alongside not only just a qualifying criteria, but also they say that you should have a sizable amount of business, an adequate volume of business to be making your case for registration as a consent manager. So that is where we are as to who is a consent manager. Simply put, everybody knows in the privacy ecosystem across globe, there are data principals slash data subjects, data fiduciary slash controller, and data processor. Consent manager is a unique concept to be looked at as an intermediary. That is not to say that a consent manager cannot be a data fiduciary or cannot be a data processor, but when they are discharging their function as a consent manager, DPDPA, read along with the draft rules, make it very clear that they would be a platform based intermediary that manages consent flow between the data principal and the data fiduciary.
Moving on to our next thought process. So we have understood, I think, a few things like how do you become who can become a consent manager, right? Like that's how we
Mm.
started. I think probably this podcast is not just for our listeners, but also to all the business people, business community across the globe that if they want to come to India and join the India story of business, right? And if they are thinking about consent managers, then these are the certain requirements that you have to think about. Moving on and thinking about what is a consent manager actually going to do, Arya? Like, let's say, while we talk about requirements, rules, DPDP 2023, everything, like, what are they actually going to do? And one more question I have posed that, if you'll tell that, next thing is, what are the organizations need to know about consent managers?
Most certainly. Akash, very relevant question. I think we have created a unique marketplace where people with credentials and capabilities can really, really start a business vertical. And this reminds me of how the whole financial payment systems have operated. There is a degree of similarity, specifically when I say degree of similarity, from a user-centric control approach between the account aggregator ecosystem and consent managers under DPDPA. We will perhaps talk about it later. So just to set the stage, I think it's not a nuanced and isolated concept. There is some amount of similarity and therefore some amount of predecessor is my considered view. So one who is looking at venturing into consent management space or the market, it would be worthwhile to take a look at what account aggregators do for the BFSI sector. Now, why do I draw this similarity? Because account aggregators also act as intermediaries. They are also required to maintain absolutely zero direct or indirect conflict of interest. They're regulated entities. They need to be data blind in nature. So you will find some of these concepts also being brought into the entire ecosystem of consent management. To this effect, the explanatory note that came with the draft rules, the last line on consent management, they say that we expect a degree of accountability, transparency, and security when we are setting up a consent manager ecosystem, a consent management ecosystem. So the pillars that they should be focused upon while developing their products and services. I'm not going on rules or laws right now. There is plenty of literature doing rounds, but I think the crux of it.
I think as I think even we have started talking business, right? So I think that's how we have changed this podcast, right? It's not. I'm. That's where we are headed. I think a lot about business, and I'm really enjoying this now. All other
Yes.
podcasts that I've done have been for organizations. This is for my fellow co-founders as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think they have a very important role to play because digital literacy is an actual problem in India. When you combine digital literacy with consent fatigue, which is a conventional problem with consent regimes, I think consent managers will have to be very mindful of how they are designing their products and services because the obligation is that there has to be a clear, accessible way for consent flow. Number one. Number two, there is a requirement for interoperability of standards. And this standard would be something that the government is going to come up with. So while we don't know what those standards are going to look like, one could fairly expect that there will be a significant focus on what are the security systems that the platform of the consent manager has in place to ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility of the data. Now, therefore, so for an account aggregation matrix, the Rebit, which is RBI's technology vertical, has come up with a very detailed framework. I think it would be a good place for interested consent managers to pick up that framework and start seeing how some of the architecture is going to play out. To be very honest, consent manager is one of those provisions under the draft rules that has come with a fair degree of granularity, not without confusion or problems, but it is a good element to just review and start preparing if you are an aspirational consent
And
manager.
Arya, while we have taken so much information from you about consent managers, we're also coming towards the end, where we are headed. As you know, this is an 8-minute podcast, right? And we want to keep it short, crisp, and people can learn quickly about these things in draft TPDP rules. One last thing is, what about conflict of interest, right? When we look at
Yeah.
consent managers, right? You are a leading law firm in privacy in India. We are a leading consulting firm in India in privacy. What is this like? What if you become a consent manager and I become is that possible, or do you think we should think a lot about it?
So, firstly, as a law firm, we can't become because it says a body corporate, and body corporate would be understood as it is defined under Companies Act. So, either you are a company or a limited liability partnership. That's the definition of body corporate under Companies Act. So, you need to have a incorporated Indian entity. You need to qualify on your financial thresholds. There are subjective criteria with respect to the quality and integrity of the management. I'll not take line by line, but one problem area that I see is that leaves a lot of subjectivity. what is a fit and proper criteria should be elaborated upon. So, number one, if the government is really desirous of this ecosystem to boom, then in that case, a lot of guidance and FAQs would be very, very helpful on some of these subjective criteria. Now, why is there a significant focus on conflict of interest? Is that, as I rightly said, they are supposed to be an intermediary between fiduciary and principal, which means that they would be catering to two sides of the same processing chain, and they cannot be caught in a crossfire situation, which would mean that if a consent manager has other businesses, such as providing security consultants or consultations or any other, for that matter, any other services, there would be need for some amount of Chinese walls. There would be need for segregating spocks for consent management functionalities as opposed to other functionalities. And there is also a increased emphasis on consent manager acting on behalf of the data principal. This made entry in the DPDPA, and it is looking like it is being trying, the government is trying to elaborate on it, where it says that it has to act in a fiduciary capacity to the data principal. People can do, now this fiduciary is not same as data fiduciary. It's used in a small case, which means it is simply saying that you have to act in a trusted position. That is my reading of it. So therefore, consent manager will not be akin to a processor. Consent manager is not akin to a data fiduciary, but needs to ensure that they have a siloed, compartmentalized function for consent management. They will be regulated entities. So if bigger organizations want to venture into this, then perhaps Chinese walls is the route to look at to avoid
Right,
conflict of
Arya.
interest.
And Arya, thank you for giving us such great information about consent managers. And as always, we look forward to partner with you, work with you, and grow with you, right, in the industry. Also, thank you for joining in. I hope all our listeners enjoyed this, learned something from this, and namaste.
Thank you.